Good morning once again. Welcome to Thematic Session I, dedicated to the unsung frame of the coastal communities. I now call upon Denard D'Souza to open the session by introducing the theme and the panelists. Denard D'Souza has a master's in ancient Indian culture, history and archaeology from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. His major area of interest is the study of ancient polities of the East and intermingling of cultures, religion, and art as a result of trans-regional maritime movement. Danard, over to you.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The first thematic session for today is coastal communities. The human involvement with the sea has been a subject of intense study in the maritime domain. But for long, the academic world has focused on the anthropology of maritime trade. In this narrative, the communities that dotted the coastline have taken a backseat. But with the advent of postmodernist subaltern studies, the narratives of coastal communities have come to the limelight like never before. The result of this phenomenon was a plethora of new data that came to the fore even while old data was re-evaluated to include anecdotes of subaltern classes. Oral histories became the tool for this new discourse in the ethnographic studies in the domain of maritime history. To discuss these trends in history writing, we have an illustrious panel of speakers. Chairing the session is Dr. Radhika Seshan. Dr. Radhika Seshan is retired as Professor and Head of the Department of History, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. She is now a visiting faculty at the Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts, Pune. Her area of specialization is medieval Indian history, within which she has concentrated on economic history with special emphasis on maritime and urban history. Dr. Seshan is the author of 3 books, namely Trade and Politics on the Coromandel Coast, Ideas and Institutions in Medieval India, 8th to the 18th centuries, and the construction of the East in the Western travel narratives, 1300s to 1800. In addition, she is the editor and joint editor of 8 books, the most recent of which is jointly edited with Professor Reela Mukherjee, Indian Ocean Histories, The Many Worlds of Michael Naylor Pearson. Welcome, ma'am. Joining Dr. Seshan in the panel discussion for today is Dr. Ranavir Chakravarti. Dr. Ranavir Chakravarti is retired Professor of Ancient History, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He specializes in social and economic histories of early India with particular interest in the Indian Ocean maritime history. Dr. Chakravarti is the recipient of several international fellowships from the UK, US, and the Netherlands. He was elected the sectional president, Ancient India, of the Indian History Congress in 2011. He also presided over the Ancient Indian section of Punjab History Congress. He has recently been awarded the Hemchandra Rai Chowdhury Centenary Gold Medal by the Asiatic Society, Calcutta. Dr. Chakravarti is also a regular contributor to Recreate journals and edited academic volumes published in India and abroad. Dr. Chakravarti has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited a vast array of books. Some of his stellar publications are A Source Book of Indian Civilization, Indo-Judaic Studies in the 21st Century, A View from the Margin, and Trade and Traders in Early Indian Society, to name a few. Besides his work in English, he has authored and edited 3 history books in Bangla too. Welcome, sir. Next, we have Commander Kalesh Mohanan. Commander Mohanan is a naval historian. He is an instructor in military history and maritime heritage at the Indian Naval Academy. He has done PhD and postdoctoral research in naval history from the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. At present, he is a visiting faculty and guide for MPhil PhD students in military history at the Naval War College, Goa. He has published more than 30 articles in national and international journals He has authored the book Maritime Heritage of India and the Royal Indian Navy, Trajectories, Transformations and Transfer of Power. He is a recipient of Junior Research Fellowship from Indian Council of Historical Research, Ministry of HRT. Welcome, sir. Next in line, we have Ms. Leora Pizarkar. Ms. Leora Pizarkar has a BA in History from Mumbai University and a Master's in Heritage Management from Ahmedabad University Center for Heritage Management. She has worked on documentation of heritage of rural India in villages of Kutch, where she has worked on facilitating the village panchayats and Setu Abhiyan, a local NGO, in understanding and identification of heritage and nature culture ties. She has also worked as a research assistant with Life History India and as a heritage explorer for Travelogues. Leora has presented papers at international conferences on various aspects of heritage, including museums, community identity, in case of the Beni Israeli community, and participatory approach in the context of heritage identification and documentation. During this lockdown period, she has conducted various sessions and talks on the Beni Israeli community with a focus on food and culture. Welcome, Leora. Next in line, we have Dr. Andre Baptista. Dr. Andre Baptista is a research consultant at the Maritime History Society, Mumbai, and visiting faculty for archaeology at the Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute of Architecture and Environment Studies, June. He has a doctorate in landscape and environmental archaeology from the Deccan College Postgraduate and Research Institute, Pune. Dr. Andre has represented universities as well as Archaeological Survey of India at numbers of exploration and excavations at sites ranging from prehistoric to the early medieval. In November 2017, he was appointed Assistant Editor of Man and Environment, the biannual journal of Indian Society for Prehistoric and Quaternary Studies, Pune. He has co-edited the 2017 felicitation volume, Rethinking the Past, a tribute to Professor B. N. Mishra, published by ISPQS. He was a consultant and a contributing author of the subsection on heritage for Spenta Multimedia's The Endless City, Mumbai, a book by the District Planning Committee, Collector Office, Mumbai Suburban District. Thank you. May I now call the moderator of the session, Dr. Seshan, to give her opening remarks. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Dinad. Good morning and happy to be with you all today. A few minor questions and a minor opening set of statements, questions more than anything else before I invite the panelists to talk on the theme. Let me start with a question on how do we define coastal communities? It is axiomatic virtually to talk of coastal communities only in the sense of those who derive their livelihood directly from the sea itself. So when we talk of coastal communities, we invariably think of the fisher folk. In fact, if I remember right, Dr. Shantakumar referred to the Kohlis, as did the chairman of the society. They talked about the Kohlis and their engagement. But there is a lot more to the coast than just fishing. We need to think of the range of activities that are part of our coasts. One dimension which is always ignored is that of agriculture. We talk of coconuts, we talk of areca nuts, we talk, of course, of fishing, but what about those who are practicing these forms of agriculture? What is their engagement to both land and sea? Another question that I think we need to talk about is the languages of the coast. There is a connection of languages all across, and I'm using the word designedly, across the coasts. By across, I mean on both sides of any ocean. So for instance, there used to be Swahili, there was Arabic, there is Persian, there is Tamil. We know that, thanks to the researches of Professor Arunachalam, we know that Tamil terms that were used in pre-Chola times continue to be used in the Lakshadweep on the other coast, on the other sea, even today. So Tamil terms continue to exist. This memory of language is something that also needs to be explored. Yet another dimension is, of course, that of religion. Religion is something which we talk about in terms of the Buddhist networks, in terms of the Islamic and the Arab traders. What about something more than that? What about, for instance, the belief which is universal, and again, universal being used deliberately, which is of a belief in some patron saint. It could be Mariamman, it could be Velankani, it could be Avalokiteshwara, it could be Mother Mary, it could be anybody. But there is always this belief in a patron saint who takes you across the seas and brings you back home intact. Beyond these, we need to look at the coast as the point where, of course, land and sea connect, the intersection of land and sea, which gives the people of the coast something that Michael Pearson talked about, a littoral flavor, a flavor of the ozone, a flavor of both land and sea, of both aquatic and terrestrial worlds. These are the dimensions of coastal communities that we need to also think about. In modern times, we have yet another dimension, which is that of tourism. These tourists are peripatetic, but there is something about going to the sea. Let us go and look at the sea. We know that Akbar was fascinated by the idea of going and looking at the sea, and he hadn't seen the sea before he conquered. He crossed the Narmada, so he looked at the sea. There is, of course, the famous poems about Cortes looking at the Pacific Ocean. Looking at the sea itself is part of a mentality that is associated with land, sea, and the connections between these two. Next, we need to look at the kinds of craft that exist. Occupations in terms of agriculture and fishing, undoubtedly. But what about net making? What about fishing lines? Calicut has, as one of its key features, Calicut and Cochin have the fishing nets that are hanging out over the harbor. There is also the entire nature of inland connections through water. The coast is the sea, yes, but it is also, in a very broad sense of the word, an engagement with water. Estuarine, deltaic, coastal, fluvial landscapes. All of these need to be taken into greater consideration when we talk about coastal communities. And as a historian, I will always say we need to go back into our own textual sources to look at the way our texts have given us a sense of the sea and a sense of the coast, probably without mentioning the coastal. The earlier ones do not mention the coastal communities specifically. And here again, I will accept Sangam literature, because Sangam literature does have mention of ship makers, shipbuilders, and the sailors, as we have in the Malamni Pothis as well. So there is a continuity of traditions associated with water, with land, with coast, and with coastal connections. All of these are part of the deliberations that we would be thinking of when we talk on coastal communities. I would now invite each of the speakers of the panel to present very briefly their point of view in about 7 to 8 minutes, and thereafter we can go into a discussion and a broader explanation of some of the points that the panelists have got it. May I ask the other panelists, Professor Ranbir Chakrabarti, first to join us?
Good morning, everyone. I hope I can be heard clearly.
Yes, very clearly. Very clearly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radhika and all my co-panelists. I'm very thankful to the MHS for asking me to take a look at the coastal communities in Bengal. I'll take a very broad overview and say a few things, taking the cue from Radhika's very pertinent opening remarks. Actually, these have given me a better focus of what I was going to tell in a very compact time. The area of Bengal, the coastal area, cutting across the present boundaries of the nation state, consist, say, from the western part of Bengal, the lower part of West Bengal, western part of Midnapur district to Chattogram in the eastern, southeasternmost part of present-day Bangladesh, traversed here by the largest delta, which is intertwined inextricably with the coast, the Sundarbans, and the Bay of Bengal, the largest bay in the world. And here, the delta, the largest delta in the world, at the very northern end of the eastern seaboard of the subcontinent, has three very powerful or four powerful rivers: the Bhagirathi at the westernmost end, then the Padma, the Brahmaputra, Lohitya, or Luit, as the Assamese fondly would call it, and then farther to the east, the very mighty Meghna. And the delta is part of the coastal population. I'm particularly the lower part of the active delta. I'm not talking of the moribund or the mature delta. The mature delta is largely in the western part of present Bengal, historical Bengal area. And the theme of this panel, the unsung performers, would take us to sometimes the merchants, mostly the crew, various types of sailors, the fisher folk, pirates occasionally, and also the openness of the coastal society and cultural plurality in this area. Now, if we look for my training, I am a specialist in early India, at least up to pre-modern times, and the voluminous Sanskrit sources rarely would talk about these people. Most of these remain invisible in the text, except occasional mention of the merchants and the navikas, the sailors or the mariners, and who are unnamed. Only once we have got an epigraphic categoric mention of a Mahanavika, a master mariner, coming sailing down probably from Raktamritika Mahavihara, that is the Murshidabad area, all along the Bhagirathi, and whose inscriptions is found in Malay Peninsula in the 5th century. He appears to have sailed down all the way along the river Ganga, Bhagirathi channel, then perhaps through Tamralipta, this is my assumption, then sailing across the Bay of Bengal right up to the Malay Peninsula. There may be similar persons but unnamed, say a Navika Nayaka, figuring in Dandi's Dashakumara Charita in the context of the description of the port of Tamralipta, the greatest port before 8th century in the Bengal Delta. And we have to take into consideration that none of the great ports like Tamralipta and Chattogram of the pre-modern times, then like Saptagram and also like Sonargaon, even Kolkata, Calcutta, were ports having clear coastal and maritime orientations, but these are never located on the sea front. They are fairly inland, and that is the importance of the delta in giving fluvial access both towards the coast and deep into the interior. The ubiquitous boatmen, the navikas, they figure in various occasional inscriptions, but also in popular literature of the Charyapadas, even in the sense of a metaphor and images. Then the Koivartas, who are the typical fisher folk in this area. And the Koivartas, my hunch is, they could have been also functioning not merely as fisher folk, but also as expert boatmen. And we know that this is the deltaic area. The need for maintenance of a riverine fleet for offensive defensive purposes, not typically a naval unit, but the riverine fleet maintained, say, by the Palas, repeatedly figuring that the riverine fleet were flying all along the Bhagirathi, the Novartis. And that will be more elaborately seen from the 16th century onwards with the riverine fleets of the Bhuyas, the Barabhuyas, the 12 prominent landholders in the Bhati area, in the area of Bakla, that is Barishal area, also in the Bhati area. This is the lower courses of the joint streams, the mighty streams of the Brahmaputra, Jamuna, and the Meghna. And also the boatmen who would be employed by the Arakanese rulers, by the Tripura rulers in the 16th, 17th century, fighting occasionally the Mughal Nawaras. But these are none of these are regular navies like the Portuguese would employ, along with the armada, which is called in Bengali popular literature as harmads. This is a different proposition. And along with that, the fisher folk, which we do not come across the fisher folk in regular by names or even by, except their occasional marginal references in Sanskrit sources. They are at the very lower rung of the Varnajati society, almost hidden from Sanskrit sources, but their presence can be seen. Take, for example, in one of the very early archaeological artifacts, say from Panduraja Dhibi, a Chalcolithic site which has yielded pottery remains, black and red pottery with the designs of fish, with the images of prawn and lobster in the coins found from Wari Boteshwar, a suburb of present-day Dhaka. It has been found also from the images of boats and ships in the terracotta ceilings and sometimes on coins, unique terracotta ships of sea-going crafts coming from the excavated site of Chandragatugarh, datable to the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. And these boatmen, the various types of crew, including the gunners, are occasionally figuring in the Mughal documents, like the descriptions left behind by Shihabuddin Talish, and also in Baharistan Gaibi, also the sarcasm of Shihabuddin Talish, that Mughal Nawara, consisting of 100 such the war fleets patrolling the Bhati area, would just simply run away at the sight of the 4 enemy boats and their boatmen and gunners coming from the Mog raiders from the Chittagong Arakan area. One of the best examples of these, the life and livelihood of these people, can be seen in 3 modern Bengali novels, classic novels, one by Manik Bandyopadhyay, Padma Nadir Maji, the boatman over the river Padma. Actually, the fisher folk comes very prominently in Advaita Mallabarman's Titash Ekti Nodir Naam, a river called Titash. And in perhaps about 50 years back, on the western sector, both these relate to the eastern part of the delta, the fisher folk, the boatmen. And on the western side, towards the lower course of the Bhagirathi and in the suburbs of Calcutta, the fisher folk's life have been penned by Samaresh Bose under Ganga. The name of the novel is Ganga. All 3 have been filmed by major filmmakers of Bengal and Bangladesh. Similar such life on the rivers have been captured by the more recent novels by Akhtaruজ্জামান Ilyas of Bangladesh, occasionally by Humayun Ahmed, and the numerous folk songs, what is called Bhatiyali, sung and immortalized by Abbasuddin Ahmed, by Nirmalendu Chaudhuri, and brought to the popular mainstream of both Bangla songs and also occasionally Hindi songs by the incomparable Sachin Dev Burman. Even in the realms of Hindustani classical instrumental music, the Bhatiyali has been immortalized in the sitar of Ustad Vilayat Khan Sahab. The interesting point is, it is the coast meets with the rivers through this deltaic area. And the delta is an arena, along with the coast, of remarkable cultural plurality, the coexistence of diverse types of belief systems. I'll give 2 or 3 examples. One
1 minute more.
One is the presence of a Buddhist monastery in close proximity to the Ajivika monastery, and Buddhist or Ajivikas often have been bitter in their arguments about each other, and in close proximity, a Vaishnava shrine in as early as 5th century in an inscription from Samakata near Kumilla, Noakhali region of Bangladesh. Similarly, the widespread popularity of Avalokiteshvara worship, as Radhika very rightly pointed out, the worship of Tara as the consort of Avalokiteshvara as providing rescue and safe passages. And very interestingly, the dedication of the main mast of a large Portuguese ship at the 16th century famous church, Portuguese church at Bandel, to the north of Kolkata, by the captain of a ship who was saved from a terrible storm in the Bay of Bengal and dedicated as his point of gratitude to the Virgin Mary. Yeah, that I shall. So, yes.
May I now ask, sorry to interrupt you, Ranveer, it's been a lot, there's a lot to be said, but may I now request Kalish to please start off, because he's also going to be talking about lives and livelihoods in a different context. Kalish, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Commodore Dr. Oracle Johnson, Director MHS, for giving me an opportunity to speak on the maritime aspects of Andaman and Nicobar Islanders. I'll just give an overview on the Andaman and Nicobar Islanders because it's 8 minutes. It's completing the history or the maritime aspects of this island. It's a difficult task. But now I'll start with just giving a geographical background of for the Andaman and Nicobar, because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it lies in the Bay of Bengal. It's around nearly 1,400 kilometers away from the mainland. Politically, it is part of India, but it's socially, culturally, everything is totally different from the mainland of India. And it has a coastline of 1,600 plus kilometers of coastline. That is almost equivalent to 25% of India's coastline. Now, when you are comparing or conducting a study on the maritime aspects of these islanders, now the first question, like as brought out by Professor Radhika ma'am, see, the first question is that whether they are the coastal community or not. Because then we have to classify this entire islanders into 3 groups. One is Andaman groups, second is the Nicobaris, and new generation because the people migrated from Calcutta and Tamil Nadu to Andamans in the recent times. That means after the coming of the Brits. Now, when we study about the Andamanis, there are nearly around 12 primitive tribal communities, which are divided into 4 groups. One is in the northern part, central part, northern part, and the outer part, that is the Ongs, Jarawas. They are totally different by their socially, culturally, linguistically, they're totally different. The way of life is totally different. The way of making. Most of these primitive tribes, they are hunter-gatherers because they basically depend upon the forest for their day-to-day livelihood. Now their connection with the sea, that's the question. How many times they go to the sea? Yes, for seasonal, because as per my understanding and the study conducted there, they're occasionally seagoing. Yes, once they are the better amongst the all Andamanis, they are the better sailors. They go for sailing because of the necessity that for getting the basic items which are not available in their islands, they go from one island to other island to get the items. But they are the shoreline sailors. They always sail very close to the shore. Even they don't sail across to the 10-degree channel. When you compare coming to the Car Nicobar again, it can be divided into 4 groups. That's a 4 groups. That's a central group, the southern group, middle group, and Teresa and other Chowra Islanders. Because largely the maritime aspect it takes place that's in Chowra Island. Because of their necessity of items and scarcity of uh, items for their survival and for making canes or other items, baskets, food items like honey, coconuts, they do sail inter-island sailing. It takes place. Comparatively, this when you compare with Andaman and Nicobar Islanders, the Nicobaris they have more traditional knowledge on navigation, and they have good expert. They are expert in winds, tide, the current, and the position of stars. Especially the Chouettes, they start sail seasonally. The period from December to April. They sail at night. They start their sailing at around between 10 to 11 at night with the help of stars. They sail from one island to another island. The exchange of items it takes place between these islanders. Basically it's a barter system, and it's a economic constructions that's in Teresa Island and in Chowra Island largely. And they prefer to have long, tall trees with less branches for canoe construction. And islanders, they prefer to have the canoes from Chowra. And they go for the fishing. That's also occasionally on the seasonal base. The fishing is somewhere that between March to June. Generally, otherwise, all these islanders, they are the hunter-gatherers. They don't cultivate much. But even compared to the modern world, the people migrated after the coming of the Europeans in the islands. The many people, especially that's from Tamil Nadu and from Bengal, they settled there. Now their activities, maritime activities, are more than the islanders. When you see the academically a question, we have to look into that whether it is a coastal community or not. For me, yes, they're not exactly the tribals, the primitive tribes. Because the reason one, because their connections with the sea, it's a very limited and it's occasionally. It happens only for the 4 to 5 months or 3 to 4 months. It's also totally different because the Andaman is their connections with the sea, or Nicobar is their connections with the sea or the maritime activities. It's totally different. And there is no commonality between this. And because when the maritime aspects of socio-culture history or linguistic history or anything of these two islands are totally peculiar or different from other islands in India. When we compare the people there in Lakshadweep, they have some commonality. Their language is same, their beliefs almost same, and the practice is almost same. Because in Andaman and Nicobar is totally out of these 580 plus islands, and this is nearly around 38 tribal groups. They have different practices in maritime aspects. Because we can sum up like this by stating that because of their basic necessity that force them to learn the knowledge of navigation or force them to go to the sea for their survival. Now, some of you here. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Kailesh, and thanks for keeping to the time. I will now call on Ms. Leora to make her presentation, and then we will go into the last sections of the next two speakers. Yes, Leora, you're on now.
Thank you, ma'am, very much. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Thank you, ma'am. And so I first want to thank the team at the conclave, and also Radhika ma'am and everyone else on the panelists. It's quite humbling and also nerve-wracking to be part of such an illustrious board of panelists with such scholars on board. So I hope I do justice to what I'm speaking about, and I hope I take back more than what I give today. I'll be talking about the Beni Israeli community. I belong to the Beni Israeli community, and that is what I'm be talking about. We believe we are a coastal community. We come from the coast, and I'll be just running because we have very short amount of time. I'll be running through the history of it, and hopefully touch base on a few aspects, cultural aspects of the community that truly makes us more help us identify more with the coastal communities around us as well. So before I get into it, who are the Beni Israelis? So for those who are familiar with and those who are not, the Beni Israelis are the Jewish community. They are the Jewish diaspora that settled in India more than 2,000 years ago. And I think they're believed to be one of the oldest diaspora on the western coast, if not not India. As a community, we have a lot of theories. There are a lot of scholars who studied the community, and there are a lot of scholars who try to come up with the different theories as to where we come from, where we have settled, how we reached here, what was the reasons, and what timeline did we follow. Some of the prominent theories that are there are put down by different scholars like Chalva Whale, Shirley Berry Eisenberg, and many others who have done extensive research on the community. One of the popular timeline is that the community reached the western coast of India, that is the Konkan coast, around 175 BC. There are also a lot of community scholars like Kehimkar, who wrote a book in 1930s, and he wrote about the community coming to India somewhere more than 2,200 years ago. And then there are also other theories that put forward that the community would have come much earlier, maybe around 700 or 600 BCE. And it may be true, may not be true. But the truth remains that they came on the western coast. They landed on one of the villages in the Raigad district, and it was through a shipwreck. Now, there are a lot of records. There are a lot of stories around the King Solomon having trade relations with India, trade relations with the Indian subcontinent, and especially the southern coast. And because of that, they would have been familiar with the sea route to India. So when there was persecution, and when they were fleeing persecution in around 175 BC or earlier, they would have known the route to come to India. And there is an understanding that chances are that they were trying to reach the southern coast, somewhere near Calicut, Muziris, that part of the country. And instead, the ship wrecked on the Konkan coast, and that is how they landed somewhere near Nagaon. Can someone just take to the next slide? Yeah. So this is the oldest, believed to be the oldest Beni Israeli cemetery, which is at Nagaon. And it is believed that the community first came in the neighboring villages around. Now, though there are a lot of theories and there is a lot of oral history around, there is a community's oral history. There is a community belief around this, and they believe that there was a ship that came from somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere perhaps in Palestine, and this ship was carrying somewhere around 40 passengers. Out of these 40 passengers, it is believed that in the shipwreck, only 7 men and 7 women survived. And these 7 men and 7 women struggled and came on the western coast of India. They landed on one of these villages, and they were taken in by the local Koi and Agri communities who were already living there. They buried the remaining people who died on this shipwreck, and this is believed to be the spot where they buried them. Now, of course, that this cemetery has been active for a very long time. There had been further burials as well, so one cannot actually put a date as how back further can one go, but there has been burials going back to the recent times as well. So this is one of the things. Now, because they came on the western coast and they landed on the western coast, they did not have much of their belongings because they were fleeing persecution. And it is believed that because they were fleeing persecution, they came with a lot of very limited resources. And when they landed, they realized that this was perhaps a mistake because they were perhaps reaching somewhere else, and maybe there were other ships along with theirs that perhaps already reached down south as well. Now, the understanding is that um, because the community um, has been taken care by the local communities, they started adapting with the local culture as well. So, some of the primary things that they took up from the local communities are their language, their food, their practices, some of their rituals, clothing, and also ingredients, local things, and they mixed up well with the community per se. um, since they lost their knowledge of who they are, what they are, there were very few things that they remembered. So it is said in the community that or it is again part of the oral history perhaps, that the community remembered a very short prayer of Shema, which basically means that listen as well. God is one. God is Almighty. They remember the practice of circumcision, that is the circumcision of the male child on the 8th day. They remember the practice of the dietary laws of kosher, and they also remembered some of the festivals and practices around these festivals as a very important aspect of their lives and their identity as being Jews. The rest of the things about themselves, like their profession, their language, their dressing, is everything that they adapted from the local communities. The profession that they took up was of oil pressing, agriculture, carpentry, and a few others. Um, though they were in very close proximity with the Koi community or the Agri communities, and later also the Kokani Muslim communities. They did not take up fishing as an occupation or a livelihood. They did not take up salt making as an occupation or a livelihood. They instead took up oil pressing primarily, and also agriculture along with it. So because they took up oil pressing as a sorry, because they took up oil pressing as a profession, they also came to be known as Shanivar Teli, because one of the key aspects of being a Jew is the following of Shabbat, or keeping the day of Saturday as the holy day or the day of rest. And this particular community did not work on Saturday. And to identify themselves, they were referred to as the Shanivar Telis. So the image I've put up over there is basically one of the still practicing last Shanivar Teli family. I think it's the Vaskar family who still practices on one of the villages on the Konkan coast, and it is their current oil pressing unit that they have. So they've clearly modernized to a electric unit from the traditional one, but the practice or the profession even today continues. Apart from that, they have also, again, I mentioned, they took up agriculture, they took up carpentry, and they also took up jobs in the Maratha army. They took up jobs in the force of Kanhoji Angre, later the British army eventually, and also much later after India's independence, um, in um, in the Indian Army, the Indian Navy. They also took up job as educators, teachers, doctors, and various other professions. This is all as and when the education happened. The initial identity of the Beni Israel, even before they got the name Beni Israeli, was that of the Shanivar Telis. Mm, um, can you just show the next slide, please? Yeah. So if you look at this image over here, it's an image of a traditional Beni Israeli family. So why I've chosen this image is because if you look at the picture, and if you look at the members who are there, you will see the woman wearing a nawari sari, and you will see the girls wearing the traditional ghagra choli kind of dress. But you will also see the boy over there wearing a very English suit, a bow tie, maybe a pocket watch, and that kind of thing. And you'll see that the community has adapted themselves. So if you read the original look at the earlier photographs and maybe much older photographs than this, you would see that women have taken up not only the traditional dressing but also the traditional jewelry. They've also taken up the traditional way of wearing the dupatta over their head, the pallu over their head. They take to the nose ring, the green bangles, the Mangal Sutra for married women, and some of these aspects continue even today. And this is something they adapted from the local communities from the region. So there is a lot of cultural impact on on the Beni Israel community from the local neighboring communities between which amongst whom they settled. The young boy represents the changing time. The young boy represents the shift in the community and the coming of the community from these coastal villages to the shift in Bombay. If you move to the next slide, please. Um, so over here, what you can see is a general map on which I have marked down the different regions in which the Venezuelan community settled. So if you see, most of the majority of the settlement is across the coastal line, across the shore, and this is where the community actually settled down. So they spread out far and wide, and they settled down in the different villages of the community. They also took up the surnames based on these villages. So who settled in Pezari village became Pezarkar. So that's where my surname actually comes from. People who settled in Akshi village became Akshikar. Those who settled in Borle become Korle become Korlekar, Borlekar, and so on and so forth. There are so many surnames, and there's so many villages that it settles in. And in fact, also becomes a very interesting ethnographic exercise to identify these different villages and surnames to find out this widespread settlement of the Beni Israeli community across the coast. Today, the only physical or a tangible proof that one gets about their settlement are either the Beni Israeli synagogues that are dotted across the coast, and the cemeteries that are even more in number than the synagogues were. And today, they're both in the dilapidated state and are probably going away. The last slide, please. So the thing I'm trying to say over here is that the identity of the Beni Israel community comes from various aspects, and it's majorly shared from the local communities. It comes with their living together and coexistence with the community. So this is the Beni Israeli synagogue, the oldest Beni Israeli synagogue in Mumbai, and this talks about them moving to city in the 1740s from these coastal villages and taking a new life. On the left, you have a very traditional Malida preparation, a cultural preparation, which comes from the local Hindu and Muslim communities. And on the right, you have a very simple but a basic Beni Israeli food, which is basically rice, fish, a coconut milk curry, and sarsawi, which is basically an influence of the local culture, local ingredients, and local food practices that has been seen on the food, with also adherence to the practice of kosher. So what I like to conclude with is that the community is traditional, though they are religious. They are Jewish, but they are also very coastal because they have a lot of aspects which come from the coastal region. The culture is influenced from where they landed, and this is what the diaspora actually looks like, with really lot more to add to it. But I think I'll just conclude here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leora, for a very interesting presentation. And something that I would like to point out before I go on to the next two speakers is the emphasis that Leora has brought in, which is of the adaptability of coastal communities. There are multiple levels of adaptation that have to happen to their own environment, of course, but also to those who are part of the coast, but not part of their own communities. So the maintenance of a community and the maintenance of a continuity of tradition, while at the same time establishing some kind of a symbiotic connected relationship across many communities. Our next panelist is, I think, Dr. Andre Baptista. Andre, are you here?
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Session.
Good afternoon, Andre. As you're 1 minute, as you are, so to say, in-house, I'm going to take the liberty of asking you to be a little briefer than the other speakers.
Sure. So
Okay.
it was absolutely riveting to listen to Professor Chakravarti, Commander Kalesh Monan, and Ms. Leora Pezarkar talk about different communities all along the Indian littoral as well as the islands of Andaman and Nicobar. However, as an archaeologist, my part in this entire thing about coastal communities deals with a little more application. And we're talking about all this amazing heritage that is part of these coastal communities that has escaped being a part of the mainstream historical narrative of our country. And right now, it has been relegated to the sides. This point has been pressed upon quite sufficiently. And the heritage that belongs to these communities, and by extension, the entire country, is currently facing a lot of risk. And how do you involve these coastal communities and get them in tune with the built heritage around them? They already have certain sensibilities because this built heritage forms part of their environment, it forms part of their identity, their experience, their cognition. And with a little bit of education, you can really make these coastal communities the keepers or the custodians of their own heritage and help preserve it, at least in the interim period, while policymakers and other stakeholders put together enough infrastructure to protect our coastal, maritime, and especially our underwater cultural heritage. So I'm talking precisely about culture resource management. And I want to illustrate my point with an example, a very brief example from an excavation conducted in 2012 to 2015 at Chandore. And I would like to credit the Center for Extramural Studies, University of Mumbai, along with the India Studies Center Trust, that under the field directorship of Dr. Kurush Dalal undertook excavations at this site. But prior to launching the excavations, the entire team of excavators visited the site and kept visiting the site for up to a year. Now, the site of Chandore is located between the early medieval port of Masla and the town of Mangaon in Raigad district of Maharashtra state. So, having spent a year with these people of this village, who primarily comprise of Marathas, Chambars, as well as Neo Buddhists, we spent time educating them, talking to them about this cultural heritage that exists in their environment, bringing it back out from their subconscious into their conscious environment. And we were quite surprised at the results. Can we have the next slide, please? So as you can see in these visuals, the entire community of the village Chandore stood up, stepped up, and took the onus on themselves of clearing up, getting rid of that vegetation that had overgrown over all these early medieval 12th to 14th century structures, mostly temple complexes. And they undertook this responsibility themselves, much to our delight and also to our fear, because we were quite scared that part of the structures might get affected by them hacking away with it using sickles and spades and shovels. But the next slide. So this is an image of the step tank. Again, same period. We have images of Shiva and Vishnu. This was most probably a mother goddess shrine. And this step tank existed amidst the village. And after the villagers were done with it, can we go to the next one, please? Well, it kind of looked like this. The next slide. Yeah. So as you can see, previous one. It made excavation work so much easier to involve them in the process of culture resource management, using them, educating them, telling them that this culture, this built heritage is very much part of their own identity and their own culture. And that really instills in them a feeling of pride, a feeling of self worth, and that fuels their action forward. The next slide. we had this almost unrecognizable sunken Garbhagriha in very close proximity to the step tank. And we had this tree which very nicely resembles shivling that was serendipitously growing right out of the center. But after the villagers were done with this, the coastal communities were done with this, again, you got so much detail about the dress stones and all. And after visiting the site a few years later, we realized that they had ensured that these monuments stayed the way they were protected. They ensured that vegetation and nature did not wreak havoc once again. And people started to visit the site, they started to take people around, they started to talk to them about this built heritage, tell them whatever information we had passed on to them. And it was really encouraging to see something like that. And I think as academics and culture resource managers, entrusting the built heritage and other forms of cultural heritage uh, back onto the coastal communities, making them keepers, buys us enough time and helps preserve this form of heritage till we have better legislation, till we have better infrastructure in place to deal with it. So these are my thoughts on giving back to the coastal community and involving them in the overall process.
Thank you, Antri, for a different perspective. And we'll go to the last speaker, who is Denard D'Souza. Denard, over to you.
I promised to finish it up in a jiffy. Thank you, Dr. Kishan. So my trip with the maritime communities of the coastal region started with my research project. I was wondering how and which community could I be studying. So when I was referring to the Gazette, I found that there were 3 communities that I would like to study. However, my interest zone was by and large confined to ancient India, and sadly there was hardly any. It was quite muted in terms of the subaltern communities when they would speak of any. One of the triggers for studying the coastal communities was actually an ancient text that is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, which makes mention of pirates and men of offering tugboat services. I was wondering whether the Konkan coast actually had any such community that assisted in the broader maritime trade. For a long time, the discourse was based on maritime trade, so I decided that I would look at communities from their interaction with the sea while they live on the peripheries of the land. While I was the other impetus that I got to study the maritime community was the Malamni Poti. I had referred it previously for my previous projects, and I saw a plethora of important, valuable information which would help in the creation of a compendium of maritime practice, of nautical practices and knowledges. I thought that whether the existing communities in the Konkan coast actually produce any such literature, any such oral tradition that they could pass on into the future. And with that intention, I chose 3 communities, basically the Dalbis, who are, they consider themselves to be emigres from Iraq, the boys and the Gubbits. The boys and the Gubbits are recent entrants into the maritime world. The Gubbits, by and large, were inducted into the Maratha Navy during the reign of the Maratha king, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, and later on subsequently by his descendants. So I was thinking, how do I, because I have experienced that in ancient India there was no such record maintained about these communities, completely muted. I said that I would take this up as a documentation process and study these communities to the T. I wanted to know their lifestyle, their discourses and interaction with other communities staying around, especially the Dali community, because it's a Muslim community. They are closely they have adopted a lot of traditional practices that women do not.
Denard, I'm sorry to interrupt. Denard, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you just get your last point and we can go into a broader discussion? So we'd have about 10 minutes to discuss.
So this is what I wanted to speak of, was that how communities, how we should be recording and documenting stories and religious practices of these maritime communities before they are lost for eternity. There is a broad speaking McDonaldization that's happening. People are moving towards cities and adopting more uniform lifestyle. I thought from that process, at least we could save some of these knowledge systems for posterity. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. One aspect that everybody has brought in is that of knowledge systems. And that's something that I would like to take up a little further over here. There are multiple levels of knowledge that are apparent from all the discussions. So we had Professor Ranbir talking about the kinds of knowledge that comes out in the textual and much later in the performative and in the literary tradition. So a textual to a performative to a narrative as a novel tradition. We had Kalesh talking about how the Andamans are an island community and raising the question of whether this is a coastal. So here I would ask you all to think about, and very briefly to think about this and to come into the answer, which is, what kind of differences can we identify between a coastal community and an island community? They are not necessarily the same, because the island, the people of the island, may not have the connection with the coast that the coastal communities have. So the insularity that is supposed to be inherent in an island, would that also be part of a mentality which would be land-based even if it is an island? Can we look at this as one dimension of an approach to understanding the nature of engagement with water and engagement with land? So go beyond the coastal community to questions about engagement with land. Kalesh, as you were the one who raised this, would you like to go first on this?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, special rights, what I said, the maritime aspects of Andaman and Nicobar is totally different from other communities in India, the coastal communities. Because these islanders, I told you, they have different practices. And their connections with the sea, that's a very seasonal based. Because they are very self-sufficient when resources are available with them. Because when they depend upon the forest for their day-to-day base livelihood, because they are the hunter-gatherers, because they're based on, because that is the reason they depend upon the forest for the livelihood. Whenever there is a scarcity, there's some particular time frame. I said because the sailing time is a different in Andamans and in Nicobar Islands. Because in Nicobar is because they start sailing in the month of December. That is exactly that the inter-island sailing itself. That is between December to April. That's restricted to itself for 5 months. And when they go for the fishing is also is not a day-to-day affair. Because when there is a scarcity of food, then they go to the sea for fishing, and this for the exchange of items, the inter-island trade that also happens only for a particular period. Even in the Andaman is also that. Because and there is nothing we have to understand, because there is no sailing it's across the 10-degree channel. That's only 150 kilometers. That's a bit of the 10-degree channel. Because Andaman is they don't, or the Nicobaris, there is no crossing of this 10-degree channel because they are restricted to their island groups, and that is also very for a limited period. It's all the necessity that force them to go to the sea. So we can say that largely they are the islanders more than there's a coastal community. They are dependent on sea. It's a very limited.
So what you're saying, Kalesh, is also that there is a notion of boundaries which are maintained in a very traditional sense, but which are not transgressed. So the notion of the transgressing of boundaries and not crossing certain boundaries is inherent in certain communities. Ranabir, would you like to comment on these? Because you're looking at a deltaic tradition where again the notion of boundaries is very fixed. Even if the land itself is fluid, the boundaries are defined.
My point, first of all, would you like me to talk on Bengal or sort of take some more
No.
from the...
Take a little broader, but briefly, a little broader sweep.
The point of what I talked about Bengal is largely on the active delta part. And the active delta lies essentially to the eastern part of undivided Bengal, what is largely present-day Bangladesh. And there, the communities I tried to highlight, their activities remain in the zone of what I call artisanal epistemology, and which is not available in the Shastras or in literature of Sanskrit or other higher literary productions, but are essentially seen in their songs and of their daily lives recorded either in the songs, occasionally in images. Take, for example, the Mangala Kavyas in the western part of the Delta, the Chandi Mangal or the Manasa Mangal. This kind of stories talk about the travails and also sometimes the successes of the merchants or other crew if the goddesses are kept in good humor. And the goddesses often teach you a very hard lesson if you do not pay adequate reverence to the goddess. And that is also the fate of Mansinga, at least described in the Annoda Mangal of Rai Gunakar Bharat Chandra. This is something of a world where it is not connected with the world of the rulers or the brahmanas or the great teachers. But at the same time, this is the world in more recent times which have come to connect the Bengal Delta with the much wider world in the sense of the Bengali literature and the poems that take the rivers, the boatmen, and the sea as a regular metaphor and the imagery. I'm not getting into the details. And the life of the ordinary peasants. Take, for example, Bengal's two perennial items of daily life, paddy. Paddy is not merely consumed in Bengal, but is shipped out as far as down south to Maldives, from where shiploads of cowries, shells, which are not native to Bengal, but are the perennial currency of Bengal, are coming. And none of these really come in the form of the Shastric Sanskritic traditions. And one thing, the myth of the efficacy of the taboos on sea crossing may be marginally effective for the Brahmanas and the upper caste. It rarely affected those who are practicing their life on the sea, on the estuary, on the delta, and out into the open sea. Thank you very much.
True, Ranabir. The gap between theory and practice is something that we've been talking about for a very long time, particularly in terms of the taboos. Let me go on to Leora. You were talking about the kinds of connections that exist in terms of meshing with the community, but still retaining an identity. So the coastal location and the maintenance of identity. So it is one of a larger whole, but that one is being retained. Would you say, going back to what I said to Kailesh, would you argue that this is also part of the nature of bounded and boundaries that come up in the time? That there is a bounded community, they're establishing the boundaries while still being part of an unbounded world. There is a 17th century statement which says the sea common to all, the coast common to all also, something like that. Perhaps you could think about that. And this is something which I would address to Leora, Andre, and to Denard. Who would like to go first?
Ma'am, this bounded community, I said, ma'am, because for the Andamans, there's connections between, because only I said there are 12 tribe communities. there in the Andaman Islands, because their connections between it's very limited. Maybe some particular certain tribes, they don't like to mix with other tribes. Even their social or cultural links, they're restricted to their own communities, like a sentinels there, because they don't want to be part of any other community as well, and they're totally against outsiders. And same if you look at the Chowra Islanders, very few islanders there in Nicobar Islands, they interact each other because their interaction is very limited, because even though because culture wise, social wise, even linguistical, they are totally different, because they have the Chinese influence, or the Indo-Chinese languages influence that in the Nicobar. So when you look at the other side, in the Andaman, that also, because there is no way of communication. Communication is a big, well, it's a medium, or it's a barrier. It's a barrier there for the communication, that for the interaction between these communities. That is also one of the reasons. And their race ways, racial ways, they're totally different. These are the boundaries, because
that is definitely ethnic origins, racial, linguistic connections. All of these are very important. And what Andre, you were saying about the nature of the cultural resource management, and what Denard, you were talking about training or making the coastal people more aware of that heritage. The notion of heritage is a very modern one. For them, it is a livelihood. So, a livelihood where they have ignored the sea in favor of the land, a livelihood where they have ignored perhaps the connections to the sea in favor of something which is much more crucial to their modern day lives, as opposed to a reclaiming of a heritage and therefore re educating perhaps. So, this is what I'm talking about as bounded as well as unbounded. There is a community which has a continuous link. There is a community that has forgotten its links. There are communities that have maintained their traditions and communities that have sustained or gone into something totally different. So, question finally, and here I'm going to quickly ask a last question, and responses are going to be all half a minute each. Can we talk of a coastal mentality, or do we talk of coastal connections and mentalities? Quick question.
Okay. So, very briefly, first of all, I think the boundaries are defined by identities of particular groups that Commander Kalesh Mohan touched upon. With regard to having forgotten their cultural past and maintaining continuity, on the other hand, I'm going to use an example from Korla. You have the Creole speaking Portuguese community over there, and the Christi community. Now, they are very familiar with their cultural past, and the connection they have with that is through their language. However, because Creole Portuguese doesn't really get them anywhere in the modern world, they are now picking up on English and Marathi as other languages and are starting to sort of amalgamate with the rest of modern society. But they have knowledge of their past. It's not like they are oblivious to it. Now, on the other hand, with the members of the community from Chandor, they had a disconnect, and it was up to us to help them reconnect with that identity. So yes, it involves a lot of connectivity. It involves a lot of understanding your personal identities and the identity of a community as a whole, that will really work towards protecting, preserving, enhancing, and bringing into mainstream the heritage, be it tangible or intangible, back into the mainstream of the country's overall historical narrative.
Leora Denard, what would you like to add to this? You are the only ones who have not contributed so far.
So, can I?
Yes, Leora.
Okay. What I would like to say is that I think boundaries are not so much physical today, especially if I have to talk about my own community. We have moved a lot from where we originally came from, and some of them, and majority of them, have even migrated back to Israel. So there has been a re-diaspora as well. But if I have to look at the coastal connection, if I have to look at the identity of this community, it's a very, very shared identity, and it comes from the people, from the roots, from the local environment, the local context of where we come from. and that is completely rooted in our villages on the Konkan coast, where we come from, and where we have settled for more than thousands of years. It's reflected in what we cook, the ingredients that we use, and we try to source those ingredients wherever in the world that we are. They are a reflection of our coastal identity. The music, the songs, the Beni Israeli prayer tunes, they are a reflection of Marathi being the language that we adapted on this land, and the and so many things more. So I think we have moved on from where we have come from, but we haven't completely disconnected ourselves and not forgotten our identity. And as you said, heritage is a very new thing, a very new word. And but that does not mean that the heritage has to be completely alien. It is in different languages. It is There is a word for heritage in different languages, different communities. We understand and associate in very different ways. I think it's the same for the Venezuela community as well. We identify and associate with it in very different ways, but we are still very much from the land from where we came from.
Leonard, quick
Uh,
last
while,
comment.
I, while I was talking about McDonaldization, and I was saying I was looking at it as a problem area, but there is truly no solution from my end to kind of you keep people doing what they have been doing for centuries ago if it's not paying them sufficient and keeping their lifestyle going on. But definitely, as historiographers and writers of history, we can take that extra step and preserve their heritage for them by writing down their stories and narratives, being the benevolent intermediary. So I don't see any boundaries in that sense of the coastal communities or communities of the hinterland. They may just migrate to the hinterland and be part of the hinterland community. So things are very fluid, like the ocean. That's it.
Thank you, Leonard.
Professor Radhika, I'm intentionally bombing the event just to say, acknowledge. I wish we could have had maybe a half an hour each to everyone. I want to take thanks to Professor Chakravarti, Kalesh, Leora, Andre, and of course, Denard, and promise that continuing engagement on this very crucial element of our knowledge inquiry will be sustained. And with that, I would apologize for not giving more time and move this back to the moderator for the closing remarks, so that we can. Thank you. You all have been amazing. I am watching. I'm not at the MHS premises, but I've been hearing you. It's amazing. Thank you. Back to you, Professor Radhika.
Thank you so much, Comrade Johnson. And I'm going to keep a very brief summing up. What we need to look at is coastal communities as part of a larger knowledge framework, as well as part of a very physical landscape. If we're looking at coastal communities, we could look at them based on what everybody has been talking about. We could talk of them in terms of connections and connectivities. So it could be upstream and downstream linkages. It could be through oral traditions that exist. For instance, the idea that, well, we do know that during the tsunami, many of the native Andaman Islanders, even though the Andamans or the Nicobars were so badly affected, very few of the natives of the islands succumbed to that disaster because they had gone away. So there is a knowledge system that exists, which we need to understand better. There is also the notion of music. While Ranabir talked of Sachin Dev Burman, there is also the rhythm of the music, which is there all along the coasts, which need to be explored, not just of the Indian coast, but also of the African or the Southeast Asian coasts. The idea is also about adaptations. How have they adapted? How have they adapted to the modern kinds of craft that is required? So we have broadly livelihood from land, from sea, and the livelihood that goes to land and sea. So net making on land, but used in sea. shipbuilding on land, used at sea, the connections of land and sea through livelihood, the connections of land and sea through trade, the connections of people through language, the connections of peoples through rituals, something as far apart as the Bali Yatra, or the Narali Purnima that is practiced on the Konkan coast. So ritual, lifestyle, cuisine, livelihood, trade, language, connections. All of these are areas which we need to think about and talk about much more when we talk of coastal communities. Thank you very much, Commander Johnson, for bringing me in. And it's been a treat being part of this panel. And thank you very much. With that, I think I can officially say that this session, we can end here. Dr. Vasuni, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Radhika, for your closing comments. The session moderated by you has nudged us well towards understanding the complexities involved in the study of the coastal community. I thank all the panelists for their thoughts and their time. We appreciate the way you accommodated your work in a manner that could appeal to audiences outside the academia. After all, that's the reason why this year's annual program was envisaged as a conclave and not an academic seminar. As our esteemed dignitaries get ready for the special session, I have something interesting to share. Maritime History Society is known for its work on the research. We are glad to announce our new initiative called Sagar Bhav. Sagar Bhav is an initiative by Maritime History Society to take its mission of using heritage to awaken maritime consciousness. MHS intends to harness literature and creative expressions as a complement to its existing projects. As a part of the initiative, all amateurs and practitioners of creativity would be invited to send their submissions that will be published on the website and perhaps eventually in Sagardhara, our newsletter. The textual or semi-textual submissions could be in the form of poems, stories, essays, quotes, and so on. The themes for inspiration would include different aspects of intersection between the maritime medium on the one hand and life and creativity on the other. With that, let me say, let's move on to the final session for the day.